Terry chimes on why he quit and rejoined the Clash during band's whirlwind early years. As soon as the Clash woke up, they were fighting for their lives. The room was filled with thick, black, toxic smoke, Terry Chimes recalls. I could only see a couple of feet in front of me. Everyone was coughing uncontrollably. We'd been breathing in deadly fumes for some time.
Flies and gnats invading your kitchen? Plug in the Zevo Flying Insect Trap to attract and catch flying pests with blue and UV light day and night. Want to check today's Amazon deal? Scan the QR code now or visit grabdeal.us/one before it's gone.
If our sound engineer Mickey Foot hadn't noticed, we'd have been goners. The punk pioneers, who went on to conquer the globe with hits like Rock the Casbah and Should I Stay or Should I Go, had been forced to sleep in their rehearsal studio after returning from a gig to find their cars locked in behind a bolted gate. It was December 1976, and it was unbelievably cold, so we turned on a single-ring electric cooker and slept around it using foam cushions as pillows, drummer Chimes says. One of them had fallen onto the cooker and started spewing noxious vapors. Choking and wheezing, the band threw all the windows open, because freezing was preferable to choking on the fumes. The terrifying incident in rehearsal studio, Camden, North London, happened weeks before the band were signed by CBS, and less than 6 months after their first gig, opening for the Sex Pistols in Sheffield on July 4. The Clash's equally combustible career was fueled by constant internal arguments and peppered by gig violence. On October 16, 1976, they were foolishly booked to support Shakin Stevens at the University of London Union, just as the rivalry between Teddy Boys and punks was assuming mods and rockers proportions. It was a bit like locking cats and dogs in the garden shed together, says Stepney-born Terry, 70. There was a lot of fighting between punks and Teds in the audience, and our set seemed to pour petrol onto the fire. Paul Simonon had to take a swing at some Teds with his Fender bass regrettably. It was the only Clash gig my parents ever saw. When I got home, I asked them what they'd thought. Dad just said the beginnings and endings of the songs were nice and tight. Terry, who qualified as a chiropractor in 1994, recalls other violent episodes. At Guildford Civic Hall, their basement gig was surprisingly depleted of punks. Later, we discovered that a pitched battle between our audience and off-duty soldiers had broken out upstairs. Then, scores of police arrived, turning it into a three-way war. When we came upstairs, the place was totally wrecked. But it wasn't the fighting that made Chimes quit the Clash, it was a more fundamental divide. I came from a very happy family and grew up full of optimism, while everyone else seemed to come from broken homes. They were always miserable and angry. All I ever heard from them and the manager was how terrible the world was and how much worse it was going to get. It became quite Stalinist with people saying, "We don't want to earn money, we'll just give it away." My answer was, "So what are you going to eat?" I don't want to give my earnings away. I want to save up and buy a sports car. One stupid rule was we couldn't have meals in restaurants. I said, "Well, what about if the restaurant is the only place that's open when we finish a gig?" Joe Strummer was totally conflicted. He wanted to be a man of the people and also to be in the biggest band in the world. Their roadie Sebastian Conran, son of Sir Terence, once talked singer-guitarist Strummer into riding from London to Manchester for a gig on the back of his bike. Joe said he was going to be much cooler than the rest of us by arriving on a motorbike, which was true, but not for the reasons he thought. It was December, the temperature was sub-zero. When Joe walked in, he looked like Quasimodo. He was so frozen he couldn't even speak. We laughed like drains. Terry had quit the band weeks before, but manager Bernie Rhodes persuaded him to stay on until they could find a replacement. They auditioned, about 200 drummers, and couldn't find one that fitted the bill. So Rhodes begged him to play on their exhilarating debut album in February 1977. On the sleeve, Chimes was credited as Tory Crimes. It was a joke, but it reflected our differences. We used to argue all the time about politics. The Clash were very left-wing and everything else. Recording the album, guitarist Mick Jones and bassist Paul Simonon rode for 4 solid hours about the bass sound, and it was costing at least £200 an hour in that studio. Joe and I were losing the will to live. The engineer eventually saved the day by suggesting we recorded both styles on different tracks. Terry relives his early years on his new podcast, Rock'n'Roll Confessions, YouTube, with his first guest, Paul Simonon. I'd been posting every day for the last year on social media, and I thought it'd be nice to do something more in-depth, so I made a list of people I'd like to interview, and while I was thinking about it, two of them, Sly Dunbar and Clem Burke, died. It's great because you think you've known people for years, and they come on and they're full of surprises. Chimes came from a grounded East End background. My dad, Bill, was a dedicated family man with no interest in boozing or gambling. He'd been an RAF engineer repairing Spitfire engines, and then worked for the Sunday Times magazine making photographic plates for printing color pictures. When I was, he told me, you can be anything you want, but you have to work really hard for it. His upbringing was Catholic, and his brothers were also musical. One studied kettle drums at the Royal College of Music and performed on the last night of the proms. Afterwards, finally leaving the Clash in April 1977, replaced by Nick Topper, head-on, Chimes tempied as a delivery man to pay his bills but was mugged in East London by two knifemen, and stabbed in the arm when they found his wallet contained a paltry £5. In 1982, Rhodes asked him to rejoin for the Clash's prestigious US tour. Topper got into trouble with drugs, so they booted him out, and I jumped back in to play their American and UK dates, says Terry, who later drummed with Generation X and Black Sabbath. The big problem was they changed the set most nights, so I had to learn 60 songs in 5 days. His pinch me moments came when they played to 100,000-strong US stadium audience and to 2 million on cult TV comedy show Saturday Night Live. On that tour, Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan both came backstage. Mick gave us advice on how to play to huge crowds. Bob seemed introspective and mostly spoke to Joe about lyrics. I enjoyed the tour, but the problems between Mick and Joe were getting worse. Months after Terry quit again, Joe and Paul sacked Mick. The Clash made one more album, 1985's disastrous Cut the CR***. In January 1986, they pulled the plugs, 11 years after Terry, then 19, had answered an advert in Melody Maker, and ended up in a band called the London SS, whose personnel included Mick, Paul, and early Clash guitarist Keith Levine, sacked when they realized they didn't need 3 guitarists. We weren't the all-man brothers. Then Strummer joined. Joe seemed anything but a singer from the way he dressed and the way he spoke, but that's when we became the Clash. He died in 2002. Joe was warm-hearted and sensitive, which made it easy to like him even though he could drive you crazy at times. Punk was messy, it was chaotic, and I loved every minute, but nothing lasts forever. Terry Chimes's Rock'n'Roll Confessions podcast is on YouTube.